Hi everyone. I will be discussing diseases of infancy and childhood. This is Dr. Romil M. Aguirre. So these are the objectives of this lecture. At the end of the lecture, the students will be able to 1. Identify the causes of death in the different age groups in infancy and childhood. 2. Recognize the more common diseases during infancy and childhood. 3. Identify the etiology, pathogenesis, morphological changes, and manifestations of the recognized diseases. And last, complete further readings in the detailed description of the specific diseases recognized. So our official reference book is the ninth or 10th edition of Robbins. We will be discussing the following topics: congenital anomalies, prematurity and fetal growth restriction, perinatal infections, fetal hydrops, and also inborn errors of metabolism, SIDS or sudden infant death syndrome, and the tumors, benign and malignant tumors. So why is there a need to study these diseases? In Robbins, it is said that children are not merely little adults, and their diseases are not merely variants of adult diseases. Actually, many childhood conditions are unique to, or at least take distinctive forms in this stage of life. And therefore, these unique diseases or these variants of adult diseases that we can see in childhood should be properly studied, especially their pathology, so that they can be consequently properly be managed. The infant mortality rate through the years in the United States has declined from a level of 20 deaths per 1,000 live births in 1970 to about 5.8 deaths per 1,000 live births in 2014. And this is also uh, comparable to the rates in the Philippines, in our country, where in 1970 there are 59.3 deaths per 1,000 live births, which has declined to 12.6 deaths in 2010. Worldwide, there are varying rates for infant mortality. In Afghanistan, it's about 110.6 deaths per 1,000 live births in 2014, and in Slovenia, it's low at about 1.8 deaths per 1,000 population. The declining rates of infant mortality rate can be attributed to better prenatal care, especially in the developed countries, and in the more effective methods of monitoring the condition of the fetus, and the judicious resort to cesarean section before term when there is evidence of fetal distress. So all of this contributed to bringing live-born infants instead of stillborn. But consequently, this leads to high-risk infants. The neonatal ICU, the availability of the NICU has significantly lowered neonatal and infant mortality rate in developed countries as well as in the developing countries. There are different diseases that affect the different stages of development of infancy and childhood. And these stages are the neonate, the first 4 weeks of life, the infancy, the first year of life, and the 1 to 4 years, which is the early childhood or preschool, and the 5 to 14 years of age, which is your late childhood or school age. And in the succeeding slides, I will be showing these diseases, and this is based on the statistical data in the United States. These are the leading causes of death in the first year of life in the United States. As you can see in the table, the top cause of death is congenital anomalies. And this is followed by prematurity and low birth weight, then SIDS or sudden infant death syndrome. We will discuss this later. And maternal complications of pregnancy, and then accidents. As you can see here, bacterial sepsis of the newborn. This is the only cause of death here that is infectious in nature. For the 1 to 4 years age group, the top cause of death is now accidents or your unintentional injuries. And this is followed by your congenital anomalies and assault or homicide, and then by your malignant neoplasms or tumors. In the 5 to 9 years age group, again, the top cause of death is accidents, followed by your malignant neoplasms, and then congenital anomalies now rank third in the causes of death, followed by assault, and then infectious cause like influenza and pneumonia. For the last age group, your 10 to 14 years, the top cause of death would still accidents. Now you can see that congenital anomalies are at the lower part, your fifth cause of death. And the second would be your malignant neoplasm, third would be suicide, and fourth would be homicide. So I have discussed to you the different causes of death in the United States for childhood and infancy. Now maybe you are curious, what about in our local setting? In the Philippines, what are the leading causes of death? This is a comparative table showing you the causes of death in the United States and in the Philippines among the different age group in infancy and childhood. Focus your attention in the column of the Philippines. As you can see, what are the top causes of death among this age group? It's actually infectious in nature. In the first year of life, number one is bacterial sepsis, followed by pneumonia. In the 1 to 4 years old, it is again infectious, pneumonia, and then followed by diarrhea. In the 5 to 9 years, it's pneumonia and then dengue fever. Then 10 to 14 years, it's pneumonia and now accidental drowning. Your congenital anomalies is third in the 1 to 4 years old in the Philippines. But as you can see in its counterpart in the United States, the congenital anomalies rank first, especially in the first year of life, then second in the 1 to 4 years. And in the United States, there are less infectious cause of death, and we can only see that in the fifth spot in the 5 to 9 years old, which is caused by pneumonia. These are the top 10 leading causes of infant mortality in the Philippines for the year 2010. As illustrated in the previous table, it is topped by infectious causes of death like bacterial sepsis and pneumonia. Your congenital anomalies of the heart is on the fourth spot, and the other congenital malformations are in the ninth spot. So what are congenital anomalies? The word congenital means born with or present at birth. So congenital anomalies are anatomic defects that are present at birth, usually seen at birth, but some may be present at birth and not necessarily seen at birth, but may be clinically apparent in later years, like in cardiac defects and renal anomalies. Congenital does not necessarily imply or exclude a genetic basis, like, for example, your congenital syphilis. This is more of an infectious process rather than genetic or hereditary. As illustrated in the previous slides, congenital anomalies is the top cause of infant mortality in the United States. So these are your errors in morphogenesis or organ and tissue development. These are basically your congenital anomalies. So one is malformation, second deformation, third disruption, then sequence, and then malformation syndromes. We will be discussing this one by one. Malformation is an error of morphogenesis in which there is an intrinsically abnormal developmental process. The word intrinsic is underlined and must be emphasized because in malformation, the cause is usually genetic in nature, whether it is involving a single gene or chromosome or involving a gene eh, with an environmental cause so that would make it multifactorial. And it may involve a single body system like that of congenital heart defect or your absence of your brain or anencephaly, or it may involve many organs. These are examples of your congenital malformations. On the left side, you can see pictures depicting polydactyly or the presence of one or more digits. And on the right side, you have syndactyly or your fusion of digits. And when these occur in isolation, they have little functional consequence. More examples of your congenital malformation, you have cleft lip and cleft palate. The right side picture, you can see a cleft lip, and on the left side, you can see cleft lip and cleft palate. So again, when these occur in isolation, they have little functional consequence and they are compatible with life. Again, these are your cleft lip and cleft palate, but now the neonates died, and this is because of other accompanying defects like your cardiac defects, especially those seen in trisomy 13. Additional examples of your congenital malformations. On your left side, congenital heart defects like your ventricular septal defect, and on your right side, your little midline malformation. We will now discuss deformations. Unlike congenital malformations, in which there is an intrinsic cause, in deformations there is an extrinsic disturbance of development. The pathogenesis is there is localized or generalized compression of the growing fetus by abnormal biochemical forces leading to structural abnormalities. And the most common underlying factor is uterine constraint. Between the 35th and 38 weeks age of gestation, there is rapid increase in the size of the fetus that outpaces the growth of the uterus, and the relative amount of amniotic fluid also decreases. As we all know, amniotic fluid normally acts as a cushion between the fetus and the maternal womb. Thus, even the normal fetus is subjected to some form of uterine constraint. When this constraint is exaggerated due to some factors, then the fetus will really have problems growing, and this might lead to some structural abnormalities. This is an example of your congenital deformation, your club feet. In the picture, notice that the feet are turned inwards. This structural abnormality is brought about by compression of the growing fetus in the maternal womb, affecting the lower limbs in this case of the fetus. So there are factors that increases the likelihood of excessive compression of the fetus resulting in deformations. So there are maternal factors like if you're dealing with first pregnancy, small uterus, malformed like bicornuate uterus and leiomyomas. These factors uh, will limit the space in the maternal womb for the baby for the fetus to grow. There are also fetal or placental factors like oligohydramnios or your decrease in amniotic fluid, multiple fetuses, and abnormal fetal presentation. We will now discuss disruption. This results from the secondary destruction of an organ or body region that was previously normal in development. So, unlike congenital malformation, disruption involves an extrinsic disturbance in organ development. This is not heritable or hereditary, and therefore there is no risk in subsequent pregnancy because the main cause is extrinsic in nature. And a classic example is your amniotic band. So this is a picture of your fetus with the amnion that suddenly ruptures and form a band of amnion or your amniotic band. And the resultant formation and bonds may sometimes encircle or compress or attach to parts of the developing fetus. Like in this picture, the amniotic band attaches to the leg of the fetus and therefore will result to structural abnormalities of the fetus. So limb abnormalities brought about by disruption or amniotic bands may lead to distal atrophy or may amputate the leg or structure that the amniotic band will encircle or digital ring constriction. And if the band will encircle around the face or the head, and therefore this will cause some craniofacial defects, and if it encircle around the abdomen, it might cause some visceral defects. Congenital anomalies occur singly in half of the cases, but in the other half of the cases, there are multiple anomalies noted. So in sequence, there is a cascade of anomalies triggered by one initiating aberration, and the multiple anomalies may be explained by a single localized aberration in organogenesis, like malformation, disruption, or deformation, that sets into motion secondary effects in other organs. An example of sequence is your oligohydramnios or Potter sequence. In Potter sequence, there is decreased amniotic fluid or oligohydramnios. As we have learned a while ago, when there is decreased amniotic fluid or decreased cushion, then there might be some form of uterine constraint that will restrict the growing fetus and might cause deformations. So the causes of decreased amniotic fluid may be either maternal, placental, or fetal abnormality. So it might be caused by chronic leakage of amniotic fluid due to the rupture of the amnion, or there may be decreased amniotic fluid due to uteroplacental insufficiency, and this is a result from maternal hypertension or to severe toxemia. And there might be decreased amniotic fluid due to renal agenesis or your kidneys has not developed properly. It is of note that the fetal urine is a major component of your amniotic fluid. This is a classic picture of your Potter sequence. The fetal compression brought about by your decrease in amniotic fluid produce these structural defects like your flattened fasces, the positional abnormality of your hands and feet, club feet. The hips may be dislocated, and due to the compression of the chest wall, the lungs may be hypoplastic. and there might be amnionodosum or nodules in the amnion. This is the schematic diagram of the pathogenesis of Potter sequence. So oligohydramnios or decrease in amniotic fluid may be caused by different factors like your renal agenesis, or there might be amniotic fluid leak, and the oligohydramnios will bring about the presence of anion nodosum and will result to restriction of the growth of the fetus and compression of its body parts, leading to uh, pulmonary hyperplasia or pulmonary hypoplasia rather, altered fasces or flattened fasces, positioning defects of your feet, your hands like your club feet, and breech presentation. Malformation syndromes also involve multiple congenital anomalies. But unlike in sequence, where the congenital anomalies can be attributed to one irritating cause, in malformation syndrome, this constellation of multiple congenital anomalies believed to be pathologically related cannot be explained on a single localized initiating defect. This is often caused by a single etiologic agent like viral infection or specific abnormality, which simultaneously affects several tissues in the body. This is a picture depicting malformation syndrome wherein you have several congenital anomalies like cleft lip, cleft palate, and cardiac defects. Before we proceed, we have to define some organ-specific terms as they may be as they will be used frequently in our discussion. So agenesis, we have discussed about renal agenesis. So agenesis means complete absence of an organ or associate primordium. So aplasia, which is a similar term, means absence of an organ due to failure of the growth of the existing primordium. So agenesis and aplasia both refers to the absence of an organ. Then atresia is the absence of an opening, like your esophageal atresia, there is no opening in your esophagus. Then we have hyperplasia and hypoplasia. It means if it's hyperplasia, increase in the number of cells. If hypoplasia, the opposite, decrease number of cells. So this is number of cells in contrast to hypertrophy and hypotrophy, which means increase or decrease in the size of cells. So hypertrophy, increase in the size of cells. Hyperplasia, increase in the number of cells. Dysplasia means abnormal organization of cells, and usually dysplasia is a precursor of carcinoma or of malignancy. These are the causes of congenital anomalies. Although we are learning a great deal about the molecular basis of some congenital anomalies, the exact cause remains unknown in 40 to 60% of cases. So it's still unknown up to this day. And for the known causes of congenital anomalies, we have genetic, 12 to 25%. We have environmental, 10 to 13%. And we have multifactorial or combination of genetic and environmental, 20 to 25%. For the genetic causes of congenital malformations, we have chromosomal aberrations comprising 10 to 15%. And examples of these are your chromosomal syndromes like Down syndrome, your other trisomies, Turner syndrome, and Klinefelter syndrome. And uh, 2 to 10% are the Mendelian inheritance uh, or single gene mutations like your holoprosencephaly. It's the most common developmental defect of the forebrain and midface in humans. We have also environmental influences that cause congenital anomalies, like we have maternal and placental infections, 2 to 3%, like rubella embryopathy was prevalent in the 19th century, but with the advent of the vaccine, it was almost eliminated. We have also toxoplasmosis, syphilis, CMV, and HIV. And 6 to 8% are due to maternal disease states like your diabetes, phenylketonuria, endocrinopathies. Uh, your diabetes cause maternal hyperglycemia induced fetal hyperinsulinemia, and this leads to fetal macrosomia, meaning these babies have organomegaly, they have increased body and fat and muscle mass, uh, and they have cardiac anomalies and neural tube defects. Then we have drugs and chemicals as a cause of your congenital anomalies, 1%. We have many of them like your alcohol, smoking, folic acid antagonists, androgens, phenytoin, thalidomide, and warfarin. And your alcohol causes fetal alcohol syndrome. Uh, this means, or this leads to growth restriction, facial anomalies like microcephaly, short palpebral fissures. You have maxillary hypoplasia and accompanied by psychomotor disturbances. While smoking, uh, there is high incidence of spontaneous abortion in mothers who engage in smoking during pregnancy, as well as premature labor, placental abnormalities, low birth weight, and the babies are prone to SIDS, or an infant death syndrome. You have also the orthalidomide tranquilizer as a teratogenic drug, and this was prevalent before, and it leads to limb malformations. Another cause of your congenital anomalies is multifactorial inheritance. Example of these are your cleft lip, cleft palate, neural tube defects, and it comprises 20 to 25% of cases. Multifactorial means there is an interaction of environmental influences with two or more genes of small effect. And the example of the intake of folic acid periconceptional, or prior to uh, in the next two slides we can see the prevalence of the more common birth defects being observed, and the causes of these birth defects may be either genetic or due to environmental influence, or a combination of both environmental and genetic, or you call that multifactorial. In the next two slides, we can see the prevalence of the more common birth defects being observed, and the causes of these birth defects may be either genetic or due to environmental influence, or a combination of both environmental and genetic, or you call that multifactorial. The pathogenesis of congenital anomalies is complex and still poorly understood. That's why in half of cases of congenital anomalies, the underlying cause is still unknown. There are two general principles, the timing of insult and the interplay between environmental and genetic causes. Let's discuss first the timing of prenatal teratogenic insult. So the intrauterine development of humans can be divided into phases: the embryonic fetus, the first 9 weeks, and the fetal period, the succeeding weeks up to birth. In the embryonic period, in the first 3 weeks, An injurious agent or teratogen may damage enough cells to cause death, while in the 3 to 9 weeks, there is extreme susceptibility to teratogens, and the peak would be at the 4 to 5 weeks. In the fetal period, the fetus is less susceptible to teratogens at this age, but it is more susceptible instead to growth retardation or injury to the already formed organs. Another principle in understanding the pathogenesis of congenital anomalies is the interplay between environmental teratogens and intrinsic genetic defects. For example, your cyclopamine, it is a plant teratogen. So when pregnant sheep who feed on this uh, uh, plant teratogen, the resultant lumps would have abnormal craniofacial development, hollow prosencephaly or your forebrain failure to develop into two hemispheres, and can have cyclopia or single fused eye. And the genetic defect here that is involved is the inhibitor of your head signaling in the embryo. Another principle in understanding the pathogenesis of congenital anomalies is the interplay between environmental teratogens and intrinsic genetic defects. For example, your cyclopamine, it is a plant teratogen. So when pregnant sheep who feed on this uh, uh, plant teratogen, the resultant lumps would have abnormal craniofacial development, hollow prosencephaly or your forebrain failure to develop into two hemispheres, and can have cyclopia or single fused eye. And the genetic defect here that is involved is the inhibitor of your head signaling in the embryo. Another example of your interplay between environment and intrinsic genetic would be your valproic acid. It is a known teratogen. It is an anti-epileptic drug. So we have a valproic acid embryopathy in which you can have craniofacial abnormalities, like you can have these features that is being shown here in the picture. And the genetic component would be the disruption in the expression of your homeobox or HOX protein. Another example is your vitamin A, your retinol or retinoic acid for your acne. Uh, the abnormalities caused by this uh, vitamin A are the following: CNS, cardiac, and craniofacial defects like your cleft lip, cleft palate, or you can have microtia or underdeveloped pinna of your ear. And the underlying genetic cause would be your TGFB, transforming growth factor signaling pathway. We will now discuss about prematurity. So prematurity is the second most common cause of neonatal mortality. It is behind congenital anomalies. So it is the number two cause of death in the United States for neonates. Prematurity is defined by a gestational age less than 37 weeks. So if you say the baby is mature or term, the AOG should be 37 to 42 weeks. But if it is below 37, the baby is premature or preterm. But if it is above 37 to 42 weeks, or it's more than 37 by 42 weeks, then you call the baby as post-mature or post-term. Other terms that may be used uh, would be AGA, LGA, or SGA. AGA is appropriate for gestational age. LGA is large for gestational age, and usually it's above 90th percentile. And small gestational age is usually less than 10 percentile of the sizes and measurements. And then you can have low birth weight, less than 2,500 grams, and very low birth weight, you have less than 1,000 grams. So for this low birth weight and very low birth weight infants, they require special care and support, preferably in the neonatal intensive care unit or NICU. And they are placed there until sufficient weight is gained and the infants have matured and are able to thrive without elaborate support systems. Among the problems associated with low birth weight are hypothermia, respiratory distress, hyperbilirubinemia, fluid and electrolyte imbalance, and susceptibility to infections, and also feeding problems. For the post-mature birth, they carry risk for both the mother and the infant, including malnutrition. After the 42nd week of gestation, the placenta, which supplies the baby with nutrients and oxygen from the mother, starts aging and will eventually fail. If the fetus passes its fecal matter, which is typical until after birth, and breathes it in, it could become sick with meconium aspiration syndrome. So this is nice to know, UPGAR score. It is a simple assessment of how a baby is doing at birth, and this is done soon after the baby is delivered from the mother's womb, and it determines whether your newborn is ready to meet the world without additional medical assistance. So it is done at 1 minute and at 5 minutes after delivery. So APGAR means A appearance, P pulse, G grimace or irritability, A activity or muscle tone, and R respiration. And you score each letter A, P, G, A, R with either 0, 1, or 2. And depending on the total score, it means the baby is normal, very low, or critically low. And the APGAR score would help the doctor or pediatrician determine if the newly born baby needs additional medical requirement like placing it in the NICU. So prematurity is the second most common cause of neonatal mortality in the United States. And there are risk factors for prematurity. One is PPROM, your preterm premature rupture of placental membranes. And the risk factors for these are prior history of preterm delivery, preterm labor, smoking, and mothers in the low socioeconomic status, and then poor nutrition. These are the other risk factors for prematurity. You have intrauterine infections. This is usually the major cause of preterm labor. So you can have chorioamnionitis, pneumocystis, and the most common organisms involved are the following. And you can also have uterine, cervical, and placental structural abnormalities as risk factors for prematurity. Usually, you can have uterine fibroids or leiomyomas, cervical incompetence, placental previa, or abruptia placenta. And you can also have multiple gestation or twin pregnancy as risk factor also for prematurity. Being born premature really is very hazardous to the baby, and the hazards of prematurity include you having neonatal respiratory distress syndrome, you can have neck or necrotizing enterocolitis, you can have sepsis, or you can have intraventricular and germinal matrix hemorrhage. Fetal growth restriction or FGR. These are babies who are even if they are term or they are not preterm or they are not premature, they have low birth weight. So you call them small for gestational age babies or infants, SGA. They are term infants but with low birth weight of less than 2,500 grams. So what happens? They are term or they are not premature but they have low birth weight. So these babies may suffer from fetal growth restriction. So they might have been undergrown rather than immature. So they might have grown adequately within the mother's womb, although they are term babies. And the causes of fetal growth restriction are we can have fetal abnormalities. Despite the adequate supply of nutrients from the mother, the babies are still not growing properly and of low birth weight. So reasons due to fetal abnormalities may be due to chromosomal disorders, especially the trisomies. You can have other congenital anomalies. You can have congenital infections like your torch. And when you have fetal abnormalities as a cause of your fetal growth restriction, this usually leads to proportionate FGR. So usually the growth restriction is symmetric. It means that if your head is small due to growth restriction, then your chest and body are usually symmetrically small also. You can also have placental abnormalities as your cause of your fetal growth retardation, and these are your uteroplacental insufficiency, when there is uteroplacental blood supply insufficiency, and the causes of these are your umbilical placental vascular anomalies. You have single umbilical artery, abnormal cord insertion, placental hemangioma, or you can have placental abruption, placental previa, placental thrombosis and infarction, placental infection, and multiple gestation. And when you have placental abnormalities as a cause of your FGR, then the growth would be asymmetric, or you call that disproportionate FGR, because there is a symmetric growth retardation of the fetus and there is relative sparing of the brain. So when your body is a little bit small, uh, your head is not really affected. So this you call disproportionate FGR, or fetal growth retardation. The babies may be undergrown also, or their growth may have been restricted in utero due to maternal abnormalities. So these would be maternal conditions that decrease placental blood flow, can have vascular diseases like preeclampsia, toxemia of pregnancy, or the mother may have chronic hypertension or thrombophilias like acquired antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, or maybe due to narcotic abuse, alcohol intake, and heavy cigarette smoking. The small for gestational age infant faces difficult course in the development, uh, including in the perinatal period, even if in their childhood and adult life. And the morbidity that arises from FGR would depend on the cause of the FGR and the accompanying degree of prematurity. And this will lead to major handicap. You can have cerebral dysfunction or learning disability or hearing and visual impairment. Neonatal respiratory distress syndrome, your RDS. This is also known as hyaline membrane disease. This is the most common cause of respiratory distress syndrome in the newborn. This is decreasing in cases nowadays due to improvement in management, especially in the administration of surfactant. So this microscopic picture shows you the deposition of a layer of pinkish hyaline proteinaceous material in the periphery of the alveoli or air spaces in the lungs of infants. The other causes of RDS in the newborn are excessive sedation of the mother, fetal head injury during delivery, aspiration of blood or amniotic fluid, and intrauterine hypoxia due to coiling of umbilical cord around the neck. The clinical course of neonatal respiratory distress syndrome, they are usually preterm or appropriate your gestational age infants. They are usually male. and usually their mother have diabetes mellitus, and they usually are those delivered by cesarean section. So when they are delivered at birthday, there is immediate resuscitation. Within a few minutes, there is rhythmic breathing and normal color is back. But after 30 minutes, the breathing becomes more difficult, and within a few hours, there would be cyanosis. The full-blown clinical picture will be the cyanosis increases, and even the administration of 80% alcohol, oxygen will fail to improve the condition of the baby. And if therapy is instituted and prevents death in the first 3 to 4 days, there will be excellent recovery. This picture is a chest x-ray picture of the baby showing ground glass appearance, and clinically this baby has RALS on auscultation. The pathogenesis of neonatal respiratory distress syndrome lies on the immaturity of the lungs, number one, and number two, the deficiency of pulmonary surfactant. So, in the immaturity of the lungs, the NRDS is inversely proportional to the age of gestation. So, the incidence is about 60% when you have uh, less mature infants at 28 weeks AOG, and you have 30% of your cases when the babies are between 28 to 34 weeks, and it is less than 5 only when the babies are more mature at less than 34 weeks AOG. With the decrease of surfactant, there would be eventual progressive atelectasis of the lungs and reduced lung compliance, and leads to hyaline membrane formation in the alveoli. The hyaline membranes are barriers to gas exchange, and this will lead to carbon dioxide retention and hypoxemia. And hypoxemia impairs surfactant synthesis, and therefore there will be a vicious cycle. This is the pathophysiology of your respiratory distress syndrome. Uh, First, you have a premature baby, and as it is as the baby is premature, there would be decreased surfactant synthesis, and this will lead to decreased alveolar surfactant, increasing alveolar surface tension, and eventually leading to lung atelectasis. And then you can have uneven perfusion and hypoventilation, leading to hypoxemia and carbon dioxide retention. And because of this, you will have acidosis, pulmonary constriction, and pulmonary hypoperfusion. And this will lead to your endothelial damage and epithelial damage. It will leak, the plasma will leak into the alveoli and will form hyaline membranes along the alveolar walls, thus restricting proper gas exchange. So on gross examination, the affected lungs are solid, they are airless, and there is reddish purple, and when you drop these in the water they will sink, and you call this hepatization of your lungs. The microscopic picture of your neonatal respiratory distress syndromes is seen on the right lower with a picture of your lungs. You can clearly see this pinkish membranous material that is attached to the wall of your alveoli, and some of these alveoli are collapsed, and uh, this hyaline membrane restricts the proper air exchange or ventilation, then causing this respiratory distress syndrome. The major thrust in the control of respiratory distress syndrome nowadays focuses on the prevention, either by delaying labor until the fetal lung reaches maturity, or by inducing maturation of the lung in the at-risk fetus by use of antenatal steroids. Critical to these objectives is the ability to assess the fetal lung maturity accurately because pulmonary secretions are discharged into the amniotic fluid. Analysis of amniotic fluid phospholipids uh, provides a good estimate of the level of surfactant in the alveolar lining. Prophylactic administration of your exogenous surfactant at birth to extremely premature infants with gestational age of less than 28 weeks has been shown to be very beneficial. And together with newer assisted ventilation techniques, this has resulted in the dramatic improvement in pulmonary function, symptom resolution, a shortened course, and a markedly reduced mortality due to respiratory distress syndrome. Management of this disease is giving exogenous surfactant and oxygen administration. There are complications of this disease even if the baby survived this. We can have retrolental fibroplasia or retinopathy of prematurity, or you can have bronchopulmonary dysplasia. These complications are now infrequent due to the gentler ventilation techniques, antenatal glucocorticoid therapy, and prophylactic surfactant. Infants who recover from respiratory distress syndrome have increased risk for other complications associated with preterm birth like patent ductus arteriosus (PDA), intraventricular hemorrhage, or your necrotizing enterocolitis. Necrotizing enterocolitis, this is most common in premature infants, and the incidence of this disease is inversely proportional to the gestational age. So the pathogenesis is really uncertain and most likely multifactorial. Most cases are associated with enteral feeding. It is suggested that postnatal insult, example introduction of bacteria, sets into motion the cascade culminating in the tissue destruction. No single bacteria has been linked, and the role of platelet activating factor, which increases mucosal permeability, is being studied as the cause of NEC or necrotizing enterocolitis. So this is gross pictures of your neck necrotizing enterocolitis. It usually involves the terminal ileum, the cecum, and right colon. So the involved segment is distended, friable, and congested with hemorrhagic infarction, or it may be gangrenous. There may be submucosal gas bubbles. You call that pneumatosis intestinalis. And the microscopic picture is there is mucosal or transmural coagulative necrosis, ulceration, bacterial colonization, and submucosal gas bubbles. Let's discuss now perinatal infections. So infections can reach up to the fetus through two routes, either your transcervical ascending or your transplacental or hematology. Let's discuss first transcervical. So most organisms affecting affecting the fetus through the route of transcervical are of bacterial in nature, and a few only are viral, herpes simplex 2 for example. And this is the fetus is infected either by inhaling infected amniotic fluid inside the mother's womb or when passing through an infected birth canal, and the consequence of this will be preterm birth. And we can also have a transplacental route or hematology, and most organisms involved are those parasitic like toxoplasma, malaria, as well as viral. A few are bacterial like listeria and tripo, treponema, and these organisms gain access to the fetal bloodstream transplacentally via the chorionic villi, and these may occur at any time during gestation or at the time of delivery via maternal to fetal transmission, example hepatitis B and HIV, or the TOACH group of infections. This is a picture of a bone marrow from an infant infected with parvovirus 19. So, infection of parvovirus B19 may result in spontaneous abortion usually during the second trimester, may result to stillbirth, hydrops fetalis, or congenital anemia. So, perinatal sepsis can be divided either early onset or late onset. For the early onset, this usually occur within the first 7 days of life. It may cause pneumonia, sepsis, meningitis, and the most common organism involved is your group B streptococcus. For the late onset perinatal sepsis, this occurs from 7 days to 3 months of life, and the involved organism are Listeria and Candida. Let's discuss now fetal hydrops. So this refers to the accumulation of edema fluid in the fetus during intrauterine growth. And this may be progressive generalized edema, which is lethal. It may be also localized like pleural and peritoneal effusion or postnuchal or cystic hygroma which are all compatible with life. These are the causes of your hydrops fetalis from cardiovascular, chromosomal to tumors and genetic metabolic disorders. And we have two types of hydrops fetalis. We have immune and non-immune. Immune hydrops. This refers to hemolytic disease caused by blood group antigen incompatibility between the mother and fetus. So the blood groups usually are Rh and ABO blood groups. When the fetus inherits red cell antigens from the father that are foreign to the mother, a maternal immune reaction may occur. So for Rh, the reaction occurs in the second and subsequent pregnancies. Usually the mother is Rh negative and the father is Rh positive. For ABO, immune hydrops incompatibility, the firstborn may be affected. So infants with blood type A or B when mothers are blood type O. This is your picture showing you the pathogenesis of your immune hydrops fetalis. So your fetal red cells may reach the maternal circulation during the last trimester of pregnancy when the cytotrophoblast is present as a barrier or during childbirth itself. The mother thus becomes sensitized to the foreign antigen. The initial exposure of Rh antigen evokes the formation of IgM antibodies that, unlike IgG, do not cross the placenta. Thus, Rh disease is uncommon during the first pregnancy. Exposure during a subsequent pregnancy generally leads to a brisk IgG antibody response and the risk of immune hydrops. There are two consequences of excessive destruction of red cells in the neonate. Uh, in immune hydrops, it will cause anemia, and if this is severe, it may eventually lead to generalized edema. And another consequence would be jaundice, and if this passes through the blood-brain barrier, it will cause CNS damage, and you call that kernicterus. Let's discuss now non-immune hydrops. There are three major causes of non-immune hydrops. These include cardiovascular defects, chromosomal abnormalities, and fetal anemia. So, in Turner syndrome and trisomies 21 and 18, non-immune hydrops is due to the accompanying cardiac anomalies. And you can have cystic hygroma in Turner syndrome due to the abnormality in lymphatic drainage, and you can have fetal anemia due to parvovirus B19 infection, and in homozygous A thalassemias cases. Let's discuss now your inborn errors of metabolism. These are genetic disorders that give rise to defects in metabolism. These are well-characterized genetic abnormalities that give rise to metabolic disorders. Most are rare diseases and are autosomal recessive or X-linked. We will only discuss three disorders here that are important. We will discuss PKU or phenylketonuria, galactosemia, and cystic fibrosis. I am sure you know about the newborn screening, and the primary purpose of this is to detect inborn errors of metabolism. So the abnormalities that may suggest that you are dealing with an inborn error of metabolism are the following. You can have dysmorphic features, you can have deafness, you can have self-mutilation, or you can have abnormal body and urine odor. You can also have neurologic features like you can have hypertonia or hypotonia, or you can have gastrointestinal symptoms like poor feeding, recurrent vomiting, or jaundice, or you can have cataract in the eyes, and you can also have abnormal motility and myopathy involving your muscles or your joints. So let's discuss first phenylketonuria or PKU. This is an autosomal recessive disorder caused by the severe deficiency of the enzyme phenylalanine hydroxylase or PAH. And due to this deficiency, phenylalanine cannot be metabolized to tyrosine. So this is the inability to convert phenylalanine to tyrosine, and you should have dietary restriction of phenylalanine so that it will not accumulate. So phenylalanine is found in most foods that contain protein, including beef, poultry, pork, fish, milk, yogurt, eggs, cheese, and soy products including soy protein, isolate, soybean, flour, and tofu, and in certain nuts and seeds. The artificial sweetener aspartame is also high in phenylalanine. So in babies with phenylketonuria, you should avoid giving this food. So what is the clinical picture of phenylketonuria? Usually the babies are normal at birth, but within a few weeks there is due to the rising phenylalanine, there would be impairment of the brain development, and within 6 months it will develop to severe mental retardation. So one third of those affected babies never would be able to walk, and two-thirds would never be able to talk. They, as the other related symptoms would be seizures, there may be decreased pigmentation of your hair and skin because there is this tyrosine, which is a precursor for melanin, and there is also strong musty or mousy odor in the sweat and urine. The second inborn error of metabolism that we will discuss is galactosemia. Galactosemia is an autosomal recessive disorder of the galactose metabolism, and this results from the accumulation of galactose 1 phosphate in tissues such as your liver, spleen, lens of the eye, kidneys, heart muscle, cerebral cortex, or erythrocytes. There are two variants. One is the total lack of your GALT or your galactose 1 phosphate uridyl transferase. This is the more common one. And second is your deficiency of your galactokinase, which produces mild symptoms with no mental retardation. So what is the clinical course of galactosemia? There is failure to thrive almost from birth, and vomiting and diarrhea within a few days with milk ingestion, and there will be jaundice and hepatomegaly and cataracts in the first few weeks, and mental retardation is can be seen in 6 to 12 months but not as severe as your phenylketonuria. The management is early removal of your galactose from your diet. This is the microscopic picture of your liver showing extensive fatty chains with delicate fibrosis. Let's discuss now cystic fibrosis. This is more common in Caucasians. So, cystic fibrosis is an inherited disorder of ion transport that affects fluid secretion in exocrine glands and the epithelial lining of your respiratory, gastrointestinal, and reproductive tracts. And this leads to abnormally viscous secretion that obstruct organ passages, thus causing chronic lung disease secondary to recurrent infection, pancreatic insufficiency, steatorrhea, malnutrition, hepatic cirrhosis, intestinal obstruction, and even male infertility. This is the most common mutation in your CFTR gene, and it results in the defective protein folding in the Golgi endoplasmic reticulum and the degradation of your CFTR before it reaches the cell surface. These are your clinical manifestation of cystic fibrosis from the most severe to asymptomatic. In comparison to the sweat test result, if this is positive for cystic fibrosis, you can have these symptoms, and if it is negative, you can have normal or mild symptoms. And in comparison also, if you have mild or severe abnormal CFTR gene. These are the clinical features of cystic fibrosis. You can have chronic sinopulmonary disease and gastrointestinal and nutritional abnormalities. You can have salt loss syndromes and male urogenital abnormalities resulting to obstructive azoospermia. This is the criteria for diagnosis of your cystic fibrosis. You must have one or more characteristic features or a history of cystic fibrosis in sibling or a positive newborn screening test. And you must couple this with a increased sweat chloride concentration on two or more occasions or identification of 2CF mutation or demonstration of abnormal epithelial nasal ion transport. This is a microscopic picture of your pancreas in patients with cystic fibrosis. You can see that the ducts are dilated and plugged with eosinophilic mucin, and the parenchymal cells are atrophic and replaced by fibrous tissue. This is the gross picture of the lungs of a patient dying of cystic fibrosis. There is extensive mucus plugging and dilatation of the tracheobronchial tree, and there is parenchymal consolidation leading to secretion and pneumonia, and there is a greenish hue of the lungs denoting Pseudomonas infection. There are many mutations of your CFTR gene causing cystic fibrosis. There are more than 1,800 mutations, and these are the different types of your cystic fibrosis. This is a table summarizing the three diseases of inborn errors of metabolism that we have discussed, namely phenylketonuria, galactosemia, and cystic fibrosis. We'll discuss now SIDS, or your sudden infant death syndrome. This is otherwise termed as your crib death. There is sudden death of an infant under 1 year of age, and the death remains unexplained after a thorough case investigation, including an autopsy, exam of death scene, and review of your pertinent clinical history. So therefore, this is a diagnosis of exclusion. In SIDS, the infant usually dies at home while asleep, mostly in prone or side position, usually at night. 90% of cases occur in the first 6 months of life, between 2 to 4 months, and the supine sleeping position is said to be the only safe position that reduces risk of your SIDS based on the American Academy of Pediatrics. When you are dealing with seeds and upon thorough investigation, you discover a underlying cause like infections due to viral causing viral myocarditis or bronchopneumonia, or the cause may be congenital anomaly, congenital aortic stenosis. So you term this as not anymore as seeds because you found already a cause of the death. So you term it as sudden unexpected infant death or SUID. These are the risk factors associated with sudden infant death syndrome. Parental risk factors, you can have young maternal age, less than 20 years old, maternal smoking during pregnancy, drug abuse, short intergestational intervals, no prenatal care, low socioeconomic status of the mother, African American and American Indian ethnicity of the mother. It is generally accepted that the pathogenesis of seeds is multifactorial, and a triple risk model of seeds has been proposed, which postulates that the intersection of three overlapping factors: one, vulnerable infant; two, a critical developmental period in homeostatic control; and three, exogenous stressor. But the most compelling hypothesis is that SIDS reflects a delayed development of arousal and cardiorespiratory control. The brainstem, and in particular the medulla oblongata, plays a critical role in the body's arousal response to noxious stimuli such as episodic hypercarbia, hypoxia, and thermal stress encountered during sleep. These are the risk factors associated with sudden infant death syndrome. Parental risk factors, you can have young maternal age, less than 20 years old, maternal smoking during pregnancy, drug abuse, short intergestational intervals, no prenatal care, low socioeconomic status of the mother, African American and American Indian ethnicity of the mother. These are the risk factors associated with SIDS. You can have risk factors from the infant. You can have brainstem abnormalities. You can have prematurity and or low birth weight. It is usually more it is usually more common with male babies. The baby can be a product of multiple birth. Uh, there is a history of SIDS in a prior sibling, and there are antecedent respiratory infections. There are also environmental risk factors like prone or side sleeping position, sleeping on soft surface, hyperthermia, and co-sleeping. Co-sleeping is sleeping with parents in the first 3 months of life. What are the postmortem abnormalities detected in cases of SUID, or these are your seeds that eventually you find a cause? So it might be due to infections like viral myocarditis or bronchopneumonia. You can have unsuspected congenital anomaly like your congenital aortic stenosis. You can have traumatic child abuse and intentional suffocation like your filicide or murder of one's own daughter or son. You can have genetic and metabolic defects. We will now discuss tumors and tumor-like lesions. So for malignant neoplasm, this is the fourth most common cause of death in the 1 to 4 year age group, and it becomes the second most common cause of death in the 4 to 9 age group and 9 to 14 age group. So for benign tumors, this is more common than malignant in uh, infancy and childhood. And benign tumors are of little concern but occasionally cause serious complication due to the location or rapid increase in size. Let's discuss your tumor-like lesions like your heterotopia or cholestoma. These are normal cells or tissues present in abnormal location like there might be rest of pancreatic tissue in the stomach or small intestine, or there may be a mass of adrenal cells in the kidney, lungs, or ovaries. These are of little significance but can be confused clinically with neoplasms. They are rarely there are sites of origin of true neoplasm like adrenal carcinoma in ovary. Another tumor-like lesion is your hamartoma. This is an excessive focal overgrowth of cells and tissues native to the organ in which it occurs. So it is different from heterotopia. So the cells are mature and identical to the native cells, but they do not reproduce the normal architecture of their surrounding tissue. So some consider these as hamartomas, hemangioma, lymphangioma, rhabdomyoma, liver adenoma, developmental cysts in kidneys, lungs, or pancreas. Let's go now to your benign tumors like your hemangioma. Hemangioma is the most common tumor of infancy. They may be of cavernous or capillary types, and they are seen mostly on skin, especially on the face and scalp like this in our pictures. They may be flat to elevated, red, blue, or when they are flat, they are called port wine stains. This may Some may be disfiguring, like the picture of the baby on the bottom, where the hemangioma involves almost half of her face. Benign tumors like your hemangioma may enlarge as the child grows, like this hemangioma involving the left leg of the baby in the picture. But the good news for children is that the tumor may usually spontaneously regress, like in this picture of the baby, the hemangioma on the right picture has regressed. Other benign tumors would be lymphangioma involving the skin, deep regions of neck, axilla, mediastinum, retroperitoneal. This may increase in size after birth due to fluid accumulation and may encroach on vital structures. And you can have lymphangiectasis, abnormal dilatation of pre-existing lymph channels. They present as diffuse swelling of part of all of an extremity. You can also have benign fibrous tumors like your fibromatosis. You can have your infantile fibrosarcoma. It has an excellent prognosis it involves the chromosomal translocation. And you can also have teratomas. Teratomas, we have two peaks. You can have it in your 2-year-old, or you can have it in your late adolescence and early adulthood. So teratomas may be mature, immature, or malignant. Your sacrococcygeal teratomas is the most common teratomas in childhood, and this occurs more often in girls than in boys. 75% of these are benign, especially if they are found in less than 4-year-old, and 12% are malignant and lethal, especially when they are found in older children. Location, usually in the hindgut, or also they can be found in the testes, ovaries, mediastinum, retroperitoneum, and head and neck. For the malignant tumors, they differ biologically and histologically from their adult counterparts based on their incidence and type of tumor, their close relationship between abnormal development, teratogenesis, and tumor induction, and their tendency to regress or differentiate spontaneously, and also due to their improved survival or cure of many childhood tumors. So these are the incidents of your tumors in childhood. You have sharp peaks found in less than 10-year-old children. Number one would be your leukemia, particularly your ALL, acute lymphocytic leukemia. Second would be your neuroblastoma. Third, Wilms tumor. Fourth, hepatoblastoma. Fifth, retinoblastoma. Sixth, rhabdomyosarcoma. Seventh, your teratoma. Eighth, Ewing sarcoma. 9, your juvenile astrocytoma. 10, medulloblastoma. And 11, ependymoma. Leukemia causes most death in the less than 15-year-old than all other tumors combined. There are differences in childhood and adult uh, tumors. In children, the tumors are more of the hematopoietic, like your leukemia, nervous, including adrenal and retina, soft tissue, bones, and kidneys. While in adults, the tumors are more from the skin, lungs, breast, prostate, and colon. For the histologic differences, the childhood tumors are more primitive looking, undifferentiated, and may show features of organogenesis specific to site of tumor. And there may be sheets of cells with small round nuclei. Collectively, they are known as small round blue cell tumors. So these are the more common malignant neoplasm of infancy and childhood. As you can see, leukemia tops the 0 to 4 year and 5 to years old. And second would be retinoblastoma and neuroblastoma. And in the 0 to 4 years old, the third leading uh, malignant neoplasm is Wilms tumor. You can add also teratomas. Let's discuss neuroblastoma. This is derived from primordial neural crest cells in adrenal medulla and sympathetic ganglia. And there is spontaneous or therapy-induced differentiation into mature elements. And what is good in this tumor is there may be spontaneous tumor regression. The most common extracranial solid tumor of childhood is neuroblastoma, and this is the most frequently diagnosed tumor of infancy. The median age of diagnosis is 1.5 years old or 18 months. So 40% of neuroblastoma are found in the adrenal medulla, 25% are in the paravertebral portion of your abdomen, and 15% is in the posterior mediastinum. Other sites would include pelvis, neck, and brain. But as I have said, majority of these tumors spontaneously regress, and it may lead to fibrosis and calcification. And this spontaneous regression does not happen in adults, so it is only seen in children tumors. This is the microscopic picture of your neuroblastoma. You can see small primitive appearing cells with dark nuclei, scanty cytoplasm, and poorly defined cell borders growing in solid sheets. And there is a privillary material called neuropil, and these cells form rosettes. The clinical course of neuroblastoma, less than 2 years old. Uh, Patients, they present with large abdominal mass, fever, weight loss. When this tumor is found in older children, they are clinically recognized when metastatic symptoms are present, like bone pain, respiratory, and GIT complaints. This tumor metastasizes widely through hematogenous and lymphatic routes, going to your liver, lungs, bones, and bone marrow. And 90% of this tumor produce catecholamines, and this is diagnostic. And with the increased blood levels of catecholamines and urine levels of metabolites VMA and HbA, you can diagnose of a probable neuroblastoma. These are picture of your blueberry muffin baby or those babies with disseminated neuroblastomas. This is a table showing the prognostic factors in neuroblastoma. It's either favorable or unfavorable. For the age, if you have less than 18 months, children or babies, it is more favorable. And if you have evidence of Swannian differentiation, it is more favorable. And if you have MYCN gene amplification, it is more unfavorable. This is a table showing the prognostic factors in neuroblastoma. It's either favorable or unfavorable. For the age, if you have less than 18 months, children or babies, it is more favorable. And if you have evidence of Swannian differentiation, it is more favorable. And if you have MYCN gene amplification, it is more unfavorable. So when there is amplification of your MYCN oncogene as detected in your fish, then it is of unfavorable prognosis. And this is found in 20 to 30% of tumors, and when found, it presents as an advanced stage disease. So this is the most important genetic abnormality used in risk stratification. Let's discuss now Wilms tumor. It is the most common primary renal tumor in children, fourth most common pediatric malignancy. The peak age would be 2 to 5 years old. 95% of tumors occur before 10 years old, and 5 to 10% are bilateral. Pathogenesis of Wilms tumor. The risk of Wilms tumor is increased with at least three recognizable groups of congenital malformation associated with distinct chromosomal loci. So these are number one, WAGR syndrome with Wilms tumor, aneurysm, genital anomalies, and mental retardation. Second would be your Dennis-Drush syndrome, and third would be your Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome. This is a microscopic picture of your Wilms tumor. Notice the tightly packed blue cells, which is your blastemal component, and you have primitive tubules, which is your epithelial component, and you have your fibrocytic or myxoid stromal component. This is the clinical features of your Wilms tumor. They usually present with large abdominal masses. They can have hematuria with abdominal pain, but the present cure rate is 90%. And these are the three adverse prognoses, and there is increased risk of developing of secondary primary tumors due to germline mutation or therapy induced like radiation. This is the end of my lecture. I hope you will supplement this with further readings in Robbins. Thank you very much.